It was one of those deceptively peaceful Saturday afternoons where the sun streamed through the windows just right, casting a warm glow across my living room, and I had finally settled down with a cup of coffee and the promise of a quiet day. That peace, however, was destined to be short-lived, because just as I was easing into the rhythm of calm, I heard the unmistakable sound of purposeful footsteps crunching across my front walkway. I didn't even need to glance outside to know. Who it was, there was only one person in the neighborhood who marched like she owned the ground beneath her feet, as if the pavement itself was contractually obligated to support her authority. It was Karen, our self-appointed queen of the HOA, armed with her clipboard of imaginary rules and a superiority complex that could eclipse the sun. I stood silently behind the door for a moment, curiosity tugging at me, and that's when I saw her raise her hand with a glint of metal between her fingers, a key. My key, or at least what she thought was my key. I blinked, confused, and then quickly amused, as she slid it into the lock with the confidence of someone about to prove a point. She jiggled it once, twice, her brow furrowing when the lock didn't. Yield. She twisted harder, muttering under her breath, her face contorting from smug satisfaction into puzzled irritation. The absurdity of the moment hit me like a wave. Here was a neighbor, not a landlord, not law enforcement, not even a repair person, trying to gain entry into my home as though it were part of her jurisdiction. And yet the lock refused to betray me. I watched her body language shift from frustration to indignation, as though the very idea that my lock would dare defy her was an insult of the highest order. She stepped back, huffed, and tried again, rattling the door handle so loudly that even my cat jumped from the couch, tail puffed like a bottle brush. And then, when reality settled in, that the key she had so boldly waved around like a badge of power wasn't granting her access. She did what only Karen could do. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. I could hear her voice through the door, sharp and shrill, explaining to the dispatcher that I had changed the locks illegally on community property, a phrase so ridiculous I nearly choked on my coffee. My home, my mortgage, my name on the deed, my private sanctuary was suddenly being rebranded by Karen as some sort of shared clubhouse she had jurisdiction over. I pressed my ear closer to the door, suppressing a laugh. As she elaborated her story with theatrical exaggeration, painting herself as a wronged authority, figure betrayed by a rogue homeowner who dared to protect his own door. As the minutes ticked by, I could see her pacing the porch like a guard dog on duty, waving her arms and peering into the window with the entitlement of someone inspecting property lines. Ow! And when the faint wail of sirens began to echo in the distance, her smug grin returned, as though she had just summoned cavalry to her side in a battle she was certain to win. I, on the other hand, leaned back against the wall, shaking my head in disbelief at the sheer audacity of it all. A grown woman, armed with a key that didn't fit, had managed to escalate an emergent into an emergency call because her pride wouldn't let her walk away. By the time the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the neighboring houses, curious eyes peeking from behind curtains to witness the spectacle, I realized that the quiet afternoon I had planned was gone, replaced by yet another chapter in the saga of living next door to Karen. The day she tried to open my home with a key that wasn't hers and called the police when reality refused to bend to her will. As the flashing lights drew closer and finally came to rest outside my home, I could almost feel the entire neighborhood leaning in with collective anticipation, as though this was the highlight of their weekend entertainment, a live drama unfolding at the edge of their lawns. Karen stood proudly at the curb, gesturing wildly toward my house, rehearsing her victim's story like an actress preparing for her big break, convinced that law enforcement would validate her fantasy of dominion over my property. Out of their vehicles with a measured calm that suggested this wasn't the first time they had dealt with a Karen call. And as she rushed up to them, pointing back at my door with the exaggerated urgency of someone reporting a hostage situation, I decided it was time to act. Instead of waiting for the officers to knock on my door and treat me like a suspect in my own home, I picked up my phone and dialed the dispatcher directly. My voice, in contrast to Karen's frantic tone, was steady and composed as I explained who I was, provided my address, and clarified that I was the legal homeowner. I even offered details about the deed and the mortgage. It's the kind of straightforward information that made the dispatcher pause, double-check the system, and then confirm my story almost immediately. "Sir," she said in a calm tone that carried the kind of authority Karen wished she had, "I'll notify the officers right now that you're the owner and that this is not an HOA matter, but your private residence." Armed with that assurance, I cracked open the door just slightly, enough for the officers to see me, but not enough to invite Karen's prying eyes into my sanctuary. I greeted them with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the facts were on their side. They nodded, receiving updates on their radios, even as Karen's voice rose in pitch, protesting that I was lying and breaking the rules, as if her personal rulebook could override state property laws. One of the officers raised his hand to silence her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and professional restraint, and turned back to me with a simple question: "Do you have proof this is your home?" Without hesitation, I reached for the folder I kept in my office, one that contained copies of my mortgage statements, utility bills, and even the property tax receipt, and handed it over. He skimmed through it, nodded, and the entire atmosphere shifted like a curtain dropping after a play. Karen's confidence crumbled visibly. The defiant set of her jaw softened, her hand that had been waving like a metronome of indignation slowly lowered, and her voice, once booming, dwindled into muttered excuses about community standards and rights as an HOA officer. The officers, now clearly done with her antics, reminded her that dialing 911 was for real emergencies, fires, medical crises, actual crimes, not for petty power plays involving a neighbor's lock. "Ma'am," one of them said firmly, "you're bordering on misuse of emergency services. That's a criminal matter." The words hung in the air like a cold gust of wind, stripping away the last remnants of her bravado. She tried to recover, fumbling through an explanation about safety concerns and keeping the neighborhood in order, but it was too late. The authority she had tried to wield was gone, replaced by the reality that she had overstepped. Again, and this time, in front of an official audience. I watched the entire scene unfold with a mixture of relief and vindication, sipping the last of my lukewarm coffee from the doorway, letting the irony sink in. All she had to do was mind her own business, but instead she had turned a simple locked door into a full-blown spectacle that ended with her reputation further tarnished and her credibility in shreds. As the officers wrapped things up, cautioning her once more about abusing emergency lines, they turned back to me with a small nod of respect, almost as if to say, "We're sorry you had to deal with this circus." I thanked them, closed my door, and leaned back against it, the weight of the encounter rolling off my shoulders. My cat slinked back into the room, tail finally lowered, as though even she understood that the storm had passed. And in that moment, I realized something important. When you're faced with chaos, sometimes the best weapon isn't shouting louder or matching your opponent's drama, but instead staying calm, going straight to the source of authority, and letting the truth dismantle the lies. Karen had tried to make me look like a criminal, but in the end, it was her own theatrics that exposed her. I returned to my couch, reheated my coffee, and chuckled softly to myself, knowing the story would ripple through the neighborhood by dinner. After all, nothing travels faster than the tale of an HOA Karen who called 911 because her key didn't fit in. Nothing feels better than taking control of the narrative with nothing more than clarity, composure, and a single phone call.